Thanks to my Ko-fi supporters that make these videos possible. You can also get a deck review on my weekly Tuesday and Sunday streams. It's the best way to support the channel.
Okay, I've had this conversation enough that I feel the need to make a whole video about it. Oops, I forgot to say hello everyone. Okay, so this will not be a video complaining about Farewell or anything like that. I got a whole video about that already you can watch. It's got game changer, so I was right. My opinions are flawless. You may bow before me, etc. But for real, I wanted to talk a little bit about Boardwipes in EDH because they feel a bit like a blind spot for players when I look at their decks. I feel like I drive home the point of how important intention is to EDH deck building. How every single slot in your deck should be thought of with genuine care, even down to something that feels mundane, like how many basic lands you're running. Speaking of lands, they're definitely the number one on the list of cards that people don't tend to think a lot about before adding, but I feel like Boardwipes are a very close second when it comes to being a neglected area of Commander deck building. There seems to be a massive amount of ennui most deck builders have about them. Oh, it's just time for the boring interaction slots. I guess Farewell and Vanquish the Horde will do. Blasphemous Act and Chain Reaction Time. Oop, a black deck? Gotta have Toxic Deluge. You get the idea. When in reality, there are so many Boardwipes that have been printed for this game that basically any deck you end up building definitely has one or two options that make a more perfect bespoke fit over the more generic options. I don't think people do this intentionally. Like, they're kind of in a gilded cage, I think. This is shown best by asking someone to defend their choice of Boardwipes. They'll come back to you with justifications for them, like, oh, you know, this one's flexible, I run this one because it's cheap, right? When in reality, I feel like most decks I see, there's actually very little thought into what Boardwipes they are running. That being said, there is a step deeper you can go to truly find a Boardwipe that has harmony with your deck. Boardwipes, like the rest of your interaction, is not something that should be viewed in isolation from the fun, synergistic part of your 99. Your choice of Boardwipe should say something about your deck, or have some synergy with it, or at the bare minimum, even mesh with anything your deck does at all, even slightly. You are not immune to this, viewer. I went ahead and asked my Discord to link their favorite Commander deck while writing the script, and here's what I saw my viewers post. While yes, some of them are running some good wipes for their deck, wow, believe it or not, people in the EDH YouTuber Discord give some more discretion to their decks than an average gamer, there were still some examples of what I'm talking about here. To keep things uncherry-picked, I decided to only use the first two decks that contained Boardwipes that were sent in. Sorry, Leo, you were technically the first one to send a deck in, but your Rurik Thar with the only non-creature being Embercleave wasn't really topical to this conversation, despite it being awesome. The first of the applicable decks was a Sultai Lands deck with Muldrotha with Pernicious Deed. Good job, viewer, on that one. But it also runs Damnation, Toxic Deluge, and Deadly Cover-Up. Wipes Muldrotha can't recur. I mean, come on, Massacre Girl is right there. Given my audience of lesbians, I'm surprised that one flew under the radar. And if you want something a little more modal, but with a lower ceiling, you can also reach for something like Harvester of Misery. And if you're Mr. Moneybags, Meathook Massacre is also a, of course, stellar option. When I asked about their reasoning, it seemed sound enough for the first 2 points. They liked the graveyard hate of Deadly Cover-Up, and Toxic Deluge was just efficient, which, yes, it is. But what set off alarm bells for me was they just said Damnation was a generically good sweeper, which, like, yeah, that's correct. But when I asked them about my suggestions, they said they liked them and that they were especially willing to try out Massacre Girl from among them. Hey, wow, you'll never guess which 3 of the board clears they cut when I take a look at their list now. The second example was this viewer's Quain deck. They were on Austere Command, Vanquish the Horde, and Promise of Loyalty, and sure enough, as predicted earlier, they had reasons for why they chose each wipe, most of which boiling down to either an argument of efficiency or flexibility. Now, the reason why I was critical of their Wrath package was that their deck had a couple of enchantment tutors in the form of Idyllic Tutor and Enlightened Tutor. And would you look at that? Out of Time is an enchantment that is also functionally a board wipe that can be grabbed with either of these options. I always recommend a similar thing with Perplex and Toxic Deluge for decks with blue and black. It's the same idea here. You can pay 6 mana with Idyllic Tutor to grab the Out of Time for a total of a 6 mana board wipe. This is sometimes incredibly worthwhile. We've all been in a position where we would happily tap 6 mana to cast a Toxic Deluge. Not trying to clown on these viewers, by the way, although I love doing that. Just pointing out that with a few tens of thousands of cards that exist, there's bound to be some that fall through the cracks. It's not their fault that they didn't know these cards existed, and it's actually a fairly normal thing to think, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, when you have options that seem to do the job fine. But you really should never stop experimenting. There's way too many options in this game to call it quits when something works just fine enough. Your work is never done if you're anything like me, and you love tinkering with decks constantly. Try to experiment and search for better options for your decks, even if you're unsure if they even exist or not. Now, what are some of the unsung heroes of the Boardwipe world? Solid inclusions that seem to fly under the radar. I've compiled a few for your perusal with some examples of decks to accompany them, where I think they're underplayed. Maybe here you'll learn about a wipe that makes your deck more enjoyable for you than your generic one does. In order to give you the vocabulary to see if a board wipe is right for your deck, though, I feel the need to define what types of board wipes there even are. I feel like board wipes can be pretty evenly divided into three major camps: parity creators, parity breakers, and synergistic weirdos. Parity creators are your Wrath of Gods. They destroy everything symmetrically. A very good choice for slow decks that would like to invalidate the early game or that play very few permanents themselves. Next up is parity breakers. This is your Winds of Wrath, Calamity of Cinders, or Crippling Fears. These wipes take a full board, including your own, and with or without some additional build around, make it so that way it impartially affects your side, while affecting everyone else in a more detrimental way. Finally are Synergistic Weirdos, which is like your Star of Extinctions and a Brash Taunter deck, your Living Ends and your Sacrifice decks, Mutinous Massacre and my Cormella deck, where if I choose to steal and untap all even cost creatures, it untaps Cormella and lets me use her again for mana that turn. Notice how all of these can be parity creators or breakers as well, but for the most part, these are kind of just wacky choices to make without synergy, and are typically used in some value-oriented way in addition to accidentally being a wipe. Also, in my opinion, in the Synergistic Weirdos camps, there's things like Kudo, Norn, Judith with the Death Touch equipment, Tetsamok, and Hirobi. Basically, synergistic combinations that perform a mass removal task like a board wipe would. Alright, let's get into talking about some of my favorite board wipes, starting with my favorite category, the parity breakers. Firstly is by invitation only. And while it's not answering any Scoot Swarms that have gone too out of hand, it will answer just about every other common commander board very handily if you are behind in name 13. And great news, if you're ahead, just name the number of tokens that you're okay with sacrificing before going in for the kill. This makes it a stellar choice for proactive decks like Adeline Resplendent Gathar, which, like, let's face it, is the kind of deck that is the board wipe target. Most Adeline players have clued into this, with 8% of decks running it. But sadly, I have a couple reasons to believe that this is also partially due to the fact that they were released literally within one set of each other. For starters, Wrath of God, Austere Command, and Vanquish the Horde, board wipes that aren't parity breakers that Adeline wants, and instead parity creators, beat out by invitation only by the percentage of decks that play them, according to EDH Rec. Cards that I would consider very much staunchly worse in most applications. Winds of Abandon does so as well, but that one's a heater, so it gets a pass. Secondly, the other reason that has me believe that this card is only in Adeline's due to recency bias and not like an actual appreciation for how powerful this effect is because it doesn't show up in other decks like Myrel, Shield of Argive, despite that deck being a similar go-wide strategy that is regularly reaching for the same wipes as Adeline, like Hour of Reckoning and Martial Coup.
Deploying flashbang.
Mass Calcify is more played in Myrel decks than by invitation only by a factor of 4, and her tokens aren't even white. Come on, guys, this is dire, and hopefully you can see now why I'm making this video. For red, I need to talk about Mizzium Mortars. Listen, you read this card and it seems overwhelmingly underpowered, right? 4 damage? What does 4 damage even clear? And the answer is chump blockers for your attackers to play or remove an opponent. And yet, despite this card's awesome power at closing the game when the board is very gummed up, and its utility of just being a flame slash when you need it to be in the early game, it is played 33 times less often than Blasphemous Act. Don't get me wrong, Blasphemous Act is a stellar card. A 1-mana board wipe is nuts and has its own synergistic homes for a variety of reasons, and I'm not necessarily saying run Mizzium Mortars instead of it, but I feel like this race should be a little closer than it is currently. Now, I know some of you are pointing at the precon effect. how Blasphemous Act is in more precons than Mizzium Mortars, leading it to be in more database decks. But even still, when we pick out non-precon commanders that care about killing people, like Tovalar, Arabella, and Ishin, we see Blasphemous Act inclusion rates in the 20 to up to 50%, and Mizzium Mortar inclusion rates so pathetic that it's not even recommended on any of their pages, despite its insane potential to break parity, a potential these decks would love to have to close out games. Now, let's talk about a couple parity creators that I rather enjoy. Once again, these are great options for decks that want to try to invalidate early games, or decks that don't play a lot of permanents out themselves. My first pick when it comes to very easy to play designs that are in the parity creator camp is definitely Damn. I am always in love with a flexible board wipe that comes with a safety valve, so it's never a dead draw. Here you get an upgraded Terror and Wrath of God all in one. Sadly, not every deck can use it since it's in Orzhov colors, so I tend to reach for Winds of Abandon or even Ondu Inversion more than this thing when it comes to deck building, but it's an insanely killer option for those that can afford to run it. My other favorite parity creator is actually Out of Time. I mentioned it earlier. Yes, it's great with enchantment synergies as well as recursion like Savine's Reclamation, but it's also just incredibly powerful. Phasing out is a killer way to answer a board. No more worries of Blood Artist or no more worries of commanders. Be careful because it can be deceptively powerful and annoying for some decks to deal with, so make sure that it's right for your playgroup before slotting it in against them. Anyway, I also like that it has strong play patterns that more traditional parity creators like Blasphemous Act and Vanquish the Horde have, where it can explode everything for cheap, and then you can deploy your own threat in the same turn to actually break the parity a bit when you draw it late. Anyway, it's time we talk about some synergistic weirdos that I love. Airbender's Wrath is one of those options, allowing you to cheat ETBs, and yes, even allows you to rebuy cash triggers from something like your Eldrazi, while still being slightly parity breaking because it allows you to keep one creature around. It's very reminiscent of something like an Evacuation if it was slightly more punishing to opponents, which I feel like is an effect that a lot of white decks would love to have access to. A lot of people know about Avatar's Wrath though, like what's unironically a really weird wipe. Well, look no further than Boom Pile and Navinaral's Disc. These two options are great cards for artifact decks that can make their whole board indestructible with something like Darksteel Forge, and that has cards that can untap them to either cheap the enter tap clause for the disc and to mitigate the randomness of the Boom Pile. Neither of them sacrifice themselves, so if they have indestructible, you get permanent board wipes that hit just about everything. Also, of course, if you're not an artifact subtheme, you can go with the iconic example of Avacyn for the discs that can help you achieve this nightmare total one-sided annihilation dream. There's so much more I could talk about with board wipes, but I'll just leave you with a couple of pointers here. Make sure that you have a wipe that fits the curve and tempo of your deck, and sometimes that means running no board wipe at all. Haha, as it turns out that Rurik Thar deck I mentioned earlier was actually applicable to this video's topic. And also, don't forget the all-powerful Scryfall tagging system, where OTAG:wipe is going to show you a bounty of fun options for your list that EDH Rec might not have granted you. I hope none of you took away the idea here that it's wrong to run Blasphemous Act, Vanquish the Horde, and Austere Command, or other more commonly known options. I run them in plenty of lists for a variety of reasons. Really, that's the core point though. My appeal today is asking you to try and justify your choices of board wipes in your decks with real synergistic reasons beyond, it's a good wipe. What I'm asking you here is to try and get experimental by using some more elusive options to see how you like them instead of staying in your comfort zone. Let me know some of your favorite board wipes down below, and until next time.